broadcasting from Park Avenue in New York City. Brought to you by Global Wealth Office at Nest Seekers International and Classique Moderne. This is Peace and Good Wealth. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Colin, Perry, Kenneth. Welcome to another episode of Peace and Good Wealth. Today we have a very special guest on this beautiful, I guess, crisp last days of the winter of 2025. We have an American artist who is not only has a degree in art history, also has a master's of architecture. His work is a combination of, it describes a combination of rigor, history, technology, and storytelling. He is an architect, interior designer, an artist, working on commissions with international museums and galleries, as well as other architects, designers, and private clients. Please welcome David Nosanchuk.
Thank you, Loy, for having me today. It is a beautiful day out there.
Thank you so much, David. So, David, give us a little bit of background because there's a lot to unpack in what you have. You're an artist, a designer, and an architect as well. Just give us a little flavor of background from family background, where you were, and how you got into architecture and interior design.
Okay. It's a mouthful. I would say I'm a Midwesterner that should have been born in the Renaissance.
Uh-huh.
I grew up in outside the suburbs of Detroit and had the good fortune of attending a place called Cranbrook. Cranbrook was considered the Bauhaus of America in the 1920s, and the Saarinen family, starting with the elder Saarinen, Eero Saarinen, his son, and Lola Saarinen all lived on the campus for 20 years, and they designed all aspects of the buildings, from the furniture to the lights to the landscape, and a lot of that has kind of educated my interest in art and design. I actually left Cranbrook really not knowing what I wanted to do and was more business-oriented, to be honest, and when I went to University of Michigan, I just didn't feel I had a place there. And I started going back to Cranbrook and photographing. I was taking a photography class. And it was the first time that I sat alone at Cranbrook and I felt an actual kind of warmth emanating from being in these spaces. And as I photographed them, I realized it was this attention to detail, the rigor, the relationship between drawing and studying and bringing all these artists and ideas together kind of under one umbrella that created this incredible kind of sense of emotion within the architecture and within the art. And being like a kid from Michigan, 18, 19 years old, I never realized that art could make you feel something. Mm-hmm. And I felt that was very provocative, that you could connect kind of a built environment and take a thought and then build it into something that could create an emotional response. And from there, I developed an interest in photography. I worked in New York after my first year at college for a book cover photographer, and then just started taking art and art history classes. And architecture seemed to be the thing that encompassed all the arts, at least in the way of thinking. So I went out to Los Angeles and went to a place called SciArc, which is very kind of conceptual in nature. And I couldn't sit at my desk and wonder what a building would look like, 10 or 15 years from now. It felt very kind of lonely. And I learned that they were teaching an intro to shaker furniture making. Mm-hmm. And I enrolled in the class, and we had to pick something to build for the semester. I picked a shaker settee. I didn't leave the shop for 3 weeks, and I completed the whole bench.
Wow.
I found the piece of wood, I carved the seat, I turned all the spindles, I did the traditional shaker finishing, and what I learned, the most interesting thing about the making of it was my kind of guru furniture maker professor said, measuring creates inaccuracy. And the thought that, that doesn't make any sense.
You would think it's the reverse, right? I mean, that's but I kind of get it. So what do you think? What did he mean by that?
Well, when you're making something and you want to be exactly precise and you want to fit things together, you actually work with the piece itself and you create templates and jigs and other things that actually make the process more exact. And so I learned at a very early stage, which has always helped me in architecture and design, thinking and making it one-to-one scale. That you think, when someone's making architecture, they are taking a tape measure out. They are building something, and there's a sequence to it. And understanding the sequence can help the contractor install something in a way or make something in a way that looks much nicer and more finished than in another way. So, the way you install a baseboard or a countertop, who likes to see like a big hunk of caulk or something, where that goes in. So if you take the time and you don't finish the sheetrock until the countertop goes in, it looks a lot nicer, but you have to educate the contractor. You have to make them more patient. You have to, but I learned that I had a really good understanding of how things are made and a passion about that also, the reason I mentioned Rome is, you go there and the things are 500 years old, but they look like they were made yesterday. And I'm interested in things that have longevity, and I think longevity contributes to the meaning of the piece, both, visually, but also physically, that something has a strength to it in the way it's made. And, I think that is always informed, art, design, architecture. And again, I keep going back to Rome, but that is like art, design, and architecture.
Exactly. And in both art, design, and architecture, which is, when you go to Rome, whether it's the columns or the way they build, porticos or arches, etc., there's the beauty of it, which is the art part of it. But all of those disciplines also, what they have, similarly, is that you could be an artist and, you could be a very creative artist, but artists also have methodology. And so do designers, and so do architects. There is a part of the learning process of becoming a better artist is improving the methods by which you make something. And it's if you're a craftsman, for instance, you learn through the years how to make things better, more precise, more efficient, and in what order you do certain things so that you get that similar effect. And in terms of accuracy, I mean if you look at David, for instance, looking at the oversized head, right? It wasn't a mistake. It was intended to be that way, so that if you're looking from a different perspective, that it looks, as if it's all proportional to the body. And those are the things that these wonderful masters were able to show us in the works that they did. So let's talk a little bit about art, interior design, and architecture. There are similarities, obviously. There's always a discipline of making sure that composition-wise, spatially, spatial relationships-wise, there's a science to that. As an artist, as an interior designer, or as an architect, is there a way? Let's say you're coming into a room as an artist to put works of whether furniture or art that you're looking at that's different than if you were looking at it if you walk in as an interior designer or if you walk in as an architect?
I mean, it's hard, even though I kind of have these three disciplines. I mean, they all are about like thinking and making for me. So they all blend together. I think the differences are ego. Art is my ego. And architecture is, both the client's ego and, science, right? And interior design is something in the middle. And, I try to apply as many kind of, different scenarios. I have a good understanding of the history of art and architecture and design, and I usually start from there. That kind of memory bank, and the difference is if I want to really give a client as an architect or an interior designer a solution, it's really got to work for them. It's got to be a collaboration between me and them, and I like knowing as much as I can about their desires, not their fears, but their hesitations, and see, where we can kind of challenge that, and also, what they think they may be missing or want in the future. And then I look at the spaces, and I usually think in terms of space and light and circulation. Like I had an architect who was kind of a mentor to me when I was young, and he said, "Well, when you enter somewhere, you always want to be looking kind of towards the light, and always kind of want to be drawn in." And I think it's just like, in that sense, it's just like a painting. If you look at a de Kooning painting, for example, it may be messy or whatever, but there's always a place for you to kind of, you don't even think about it, but you kind of subtly enter the painting, and you can kind of circulate through it and then find yourself somewhere else and leave the painting. And I think architecture and design's the same way, whether it's visual or physical, that, you don't want to feel, like you're in the subway and you're trying to get on the subway car. You want to feel like kind of the field is open for you, and you can kind of interact, and you're not kind of forced into something. I think that creates a spirit. It's almost like the space in between the things.
Right.
Is important, and dictates a lot of the experience.
In photography, as well as in painting, the play between the light and shadow, it dictates everything, right? It gives you the mood. It gives you the feeling of the art. It's what really connects you. It's what you're really drawn to. Either the darkness of the space or the lightness of the space, the light behind somebody's eyes. If it's a portrait, really informs you about sort of what the artist is trying to say. It would tell you whether they may look happy or not as happy, or whether they just woke up in the morning, and all of that is really what we spot. And it's interesting to kind of think about that in terms of architecture and interior design. I guess in interior design, it's what we call moments, right?
Right.
Where it just hits exactly that type of light that gives you this specific feeling of in that particular space. But I've never thought about it in terms of architecture. I've always thought of architecture as being very sort of very spatial. It's a science, if you like, constructing something and efficiently, and where there's a flow. Light being part of it, but not as much, I guess, because I think of structure in terms of architecture versus the interiors itself, but combined, it makes a lot of sense, which I think a lot of people don't, when they're building something, they don't necessarily consider it. So already pre-considered, by these professionals for them.
Yeah.
How do you? So when we do developments, the interesting thing is always that it is never the broker or the agent that's trying to sell it that's in conflict with anyone in the room. It's almost always the interior designer and the architect, right? So now sometimes. Because the interior designer wants to make it look a certain way, and the architect makes is sort of giving creating space, and they have a specific very vision for that space as well. It's not always the same. In some cases, they collaborate or they're in the same company, so it's a little bit easier. How do you, if you're working with an interior designer versus, let's say, an architect, how do you relate, to them? And what if they're vision is not exactly aligned with what you're thinking? How do you make that sort of adjustment?
I mean, the interior designer is in a way a client, like the client. I mean, the client the client also has the ultimate say. But I think, again, it's it's interviewing the designer and understanding what they want to get out of the space, how they want the space to feel, what kind of maybe colors or materiality, is it going to be all, if someone wants something, 17th century France or something, it's probably not, I don't know what to do with that, but maybe there's some radical, like modern juxtaposition to that. But it's, I think, again, it's, to me, going back to light and materials is, what are they what kind of palette are they thinking about? For example, lighting can be very kind of sharp and direct and specific in areas and have this chiaroscuro kind of light and dark effect, or it can be, if you go to like the redone period rooms, the American Wing at the Met, it's this incredible kind of soft, filtered light where there's no shadows.
Yes.
And both of those things call for different types of art potentially. If you're gonna light modern art, you probably light it differently than that. Also knowing what the client has, what that they want to bring. Some clients have collections and things like that. So I try to understand that, and then I try to, my work, I'd say, is kind of, timeless in the sense that I'm using materials that have been used a long time. So, even if it's kind of sparing, it feels kind of rich and sophisticated without being overwhelming, whether it's, specific woods or metal finishes or, details. They're all kind of very resolved. And I think, that kind of lends itself to many different avenues for the designer. So, I want to support them. I mean, it's really a concert, right? So, and I want them to understand my vision, obviously. So, I think it's really just a matter of inclusion and hopefully, taking the lead on the process.
So let's talk a little bit more about your past projects. You had the table lamp. Let's start with the table lamp, which was Best in Show in, when was that, 2000?
I did a series. It was my first series. It debuted at ICFF. I guess that's 25 years ago now. You're dating me a little bit. And I did a whole collection called Sharp and Heavy. It was wood and bronze furniture and some lighting. And the lighting piece, I think, was the most interesting. It was, I think art and design moves forward as technology moves forward and materials move forward. So it's actually what I consider kind of the meeting of lines and form. It's really a drawing that becomes a three-dimensional puzzle. And in the process of making it, it's actually 12 vertical ribs and 5 or 6 horizontal ribs that all get water jet or laser cut, and then they get put together like a puzzle, and then it gets illuminated from within. And I almost think of it as like a three-dimensional stained glass. In the early 20th century, especially at Cranbrook, you could see, really there's a strong relationship between drawing and the architecture. So you actually kind of can see the lines within the architecture and even the line weights, and so I wanted to create something that was like this three-dimensional drawing that was both two-dimensional and three-dimensional at the same time. And it was very well received. I've done a number of iterations. A few years later, I did another version of without a stem, and a curator at the Museum of the City of New York, Donald Albrecht, included that in a Made in New York show. And then subsequently it was published in the Times that week. So that was like my first big article, and it was called A Puzzle Solved.
That's fantastic.
And interestingly enough, as we talk about, again, measuring and making, and my first experience making this bench, you wouldn't think so, but the actual metal, aluminum, whether it's cast or extruded, it's not the consistent thickness. It's actually varies in tolerances by a few millimeters. So when you design the puzzle, you can't design it like a drawing where everything fits perfectly. You actually have to, the material actually has its own life that you have to be aware of for it to fit together.
Very much. Well, I think woodwork, and very much like the marble statues, right? It depends on, even though they're the same material, there are different weaknesses in the material itself that you have to adjust for as you're creating them.
Yes, and I think that's when we start dealing with nature in a way, right? Things that we can't control, which as an artist you have to kind of embrace,
Right.
And I think that's what makes things more interesting as an artist and a maker.
I think the challenge of being able, to do that. So it's interesting. When I was talking to someone yesterday about art, right? If you have, let's say you're in Murano, and you have someone who is making this vase, right? And this person has learned from a master who's learned from a master who's learned from a master who's learned from a master, right? And after learning all of these techniques through the years, it's passed on to you, and we take that vase and we say this is art, right? But similarly, if you have the same vase or similar looking vase, it was done in a factory, right? And you put it side by side. The other one is art. The other one isn't art, right? We regard it as such. And I think part of that is that the humanity of the mistakes, the errors, the adjustments that you do as you create something puts a little bit of something else into an object. Even though they're they look the same, or they may look the same or very similar to each other, whatever that touch of that human mind puts into the creation of it, sort of like infuses this idea of art in whatever you make. So a furniture that was handmade by a craftsman or an artisan, right, or the woodwork that they create. It's still fascinating because there's tiny things that we may not even be seen by the naked eye that human beings sort of like compensates for as they start to carve out things and create things. You also did a series on photographs, though. That's quite different, right? So tell us what you did. You took photos from Rome and
at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, and I was working with this avant-garde company called Flavor Paper. They're a wallpaper company in Brooklyn, and it was late one night, and originally I thought I'd be doing more of just a drawing series that would translate to wallpaper, and I was going through all my photographs, and I just started printing them out and collaging them, and I realized that there was something interesting about this sense of like foreground, middle ground, background, or your relationship to something and its detail, and at that point, I was of the feeling that kind of like details are dead, and people don't have the time to really explore things, and things are kind of like a one-liner.
And these photographs, are they monochromatic? Are they black and white?
They're color photographs that I took with like a Canon digital camera. And they're in particular in Rome, like there's the Roman colonnade at St. Peter's. Basically, if you look at it from far away, this wallpaper is called Colonnade. I actually exhibited it at a few shows, and Ralph Pucci had Colonnade in one of his floors for a few months. It doesn't look anything like a colonnade. It just looks like a pattern. But as you approach it and you get closer and closer to it, more detail meets your eye. So rather than learning less about something or not learning anything, as more intimate you're willing to be with it, the details reveal themselves. So as you get close enough, you'll actually see people with backpacks and the colonnade itself and the lights hanging in the colonnade. So it's all about kind of distance and experience and time and detail, which, is very evocative of things that happen in Rome. Like it's amazing, if you keep looking at something, any surface in Rome, the ceiling, the floor, I mean, it's always giving something to you, And I find that very exciting. And so I had these Roman photographs, and I was working on that. And then I said, well, maybe I should go to the Met, because Met has been kind of my catalog of interests, since I've been in New York. And I'm particularly interested in Tiffany and 20th century decorative art. So I photographed a Tiffany stained glass piece, and also at the American Wing, and also an Auguste Godin's sculpture of a woman. And I turned those both into wallpaper. And both are actually now in the collection of the Late Art Decoratif in Paris and the Cooper Hewitt here in New York City. And the Tiffany piece was also exhibited at Cranbrook at the museum there in Bloomfield Hills. And again, what I find interesting, even though all these subject matters are, from 1600 or 1500 to, the 20th century, they all felt relevant, and they all had kind of enough of a kind of charisma and kaleidoscopic kind of excitement for people to, be interested in visually interested, to be drawn in and experience that. And, to me, it's a question of like, when is art not art anymore? I took something that's very old and tried to make it new.
Well, I think it wasn't the definition of art. It's both timely and timeless. And so every time you look at it, and what's interesting is you take something as old as that, and when you look at the actual print of the wallpaper, it feels very modern, actually. And because what you're seeing is it's basically the shapes and the designs. You're not focusing too much on the details. So unless you really go close to it and try to figure out what it is, it feels like almost like a modern print. And which I think also Europeans are very good at doing this, mixing the very old with the new to create something that's unique. I always say that they have these beautiful buildings in France and in Italy that have these very intricate moldings, but then just sort of like white walls and very clean furniture, and they all go together, and they're very elegant and they're very sophisticated. So there is a way to kind of like fuse that together. So in your current practice, I should say. What are the trends that you feel are have come and gone, and what's coming up next? What looks like? What are people interested in doing these days?
I mean, I think people who are collecting art in the last 15 or 20 years, design has become an extension of that. So it's not just on the walls. People are collecting limited edition rugs or lights or furniture or one-of-a-kind pieces. They're also mixing them with older antiques and art. And I think that's opened up a lot of opportunities for, let's say, Design Miami, which is, kind of the design aspect of Art Basel, but now is in not just Miami, but Shanghai, LA, Paris. There's a lot more design galleries in New York. There's a lot more designers who are kind of purveying that. And I think it gives opportunities for more design objects in the marketplace. I think there's an awareness for objects, and I think at a more commercial scale, I think the iPhone became kind of people aware of things, of objects, being an accessory, I guess. And so I kind of see all those things merging in a way. You see art becoming design. Hermes is kind of at this new kind of height with what they're doing. I think there's this kind of, amalgam of things that are kind of crossing over and mixing. And I think that's good for design, good for art. And,
does it translate in architecture as well? Are people building homes now to, that accommodates, sort of like arts and, and design as part of it? Are the lines, I know I see a lot of very common sort of like staged, rooms, and they look, the same over and over and over again. And I would love for there to be a day where none of those, exist. I'd love to see people doing a lot more, injecting a lot more of their personalities into the, and not just the, okay, it looks clean and neat for TikTok, but it's not really the, how people sort of like lived. Are they, or are we just going to the point where people are less concerned about that, and they're more into the modern clean lines and minimalist versus maximalist?
I think the bigger the thing is, the less risk people are willing to take, and they think about the dollar rather than their emotions. And I think that's in contrast to great work.
Right.
I think that you have to take risks, and you have to be open to new ideas. And when we talk about modern versus old, I mean, people say, oh, this is so new, or this or that, it's so exciting. And I mean, if you see Rome, or you see Gaudi, or you see these things, there's nothing more interesting or newer than that,
Right.
And that was done with no computers,
Yes.
I mean, and the response to those things, go beyond something you can write down or photograph. And I think that's, in a world where we're so busy and trying to check things off and trying to like something or get an approval for this or that, I think the idea of time is kind of the adversary to art and design, in the sense that, if you say you could build a house in 2 years and it's going to be this, or you could build it in 2.5 years and it's going to be that, people are going to choose the 2 years.
Yes.
And I think it makes sense. That's kind of the world we're in. Things are going faster and faster. But I think
that the priorities there, seem to have really changed, because if we look throughout history, in any culture, right, the luxury was time. So they spent a lot of time building. And in those spaces, they spent a lot of time, when we talk about taking risks, much of the art that we know and is precious are risks taken by very wealthy individuals, in the face of what they're told not to have in their homes.
Correct.
So there was a time when only religious things were in homes, and putting your own portraits was a big no, and then all of a sudden we see all of these gigantic portraits of the Medicis and all of that stuff, being incorporated as part of that, and it's. I think it's a daringness of artists and designers and architects that are really the ones that leave a mark in history. It's not how quickly things are, because what I see is that the quicker we have things, the less connected people are to them. So, if you can make if you make clothes very quickly, you're most likely going to throw that out very quickly as well. I mean, we talk about Hermes or, Rolexes and
Right.
Patek Philippe's. The reason people, it takes forever, to make them and to get them and to earn them. And so they're passed down from one generation, to the next. But if you give them, something that could be made in, very easily in 1 month, there will be no connection there. It'll be just gone, and after a short period of time. And I think that's the quandary that we're in now, in a world of instant gratification.
Well, I think it's kind of consumption versus absorption,
Exactly.
right? You kind of you can't make a risotto in 5 minutes.
Yes.
It needs time for the wine and the stock to kind of infiltrate and marry the rice. And I think that it's hard for people to slow down and actually even deal with themselves. I mean, it's just part of life. And I think, again, if you go to Italy, for example, I mean, keep bringing it up, but every time I go to Milan and I come back, I'm like, oh, I'm just going to live like this. I'm going to enjoy my breakfast and have a lunch. And then all of a sudden you get tied up in life and you're trying to get things done. And it's a bit of a race. And I think,
I think that's the difference between Italians and most of us. It's that in that waiting lies their life, right? they understand that. So while you're waiting for the risotto to finish and be completely cooked, they don't think of that as like sort of like wasted time. They actually think that that is the important part of time. The enjoyment of it, yes, is great, but through the making of it is just as good as the actual completion, which we I think especially now in the modern days sort of like skip. And in any case, so we can talk forever about all of these things. Thank you very much, David. I really appreciated speaking with you today about a lot about art and design and architecture. We wish you well in everything that you do. And I guess that's it, for us folks. So on behalf of Colin Megley, Perry Law, Kenneth Moore, and the rest of Global Wealth Office, this is Loy Carlos wishing you peace and good wealth.